On behalf of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, I welcome you all to this book launch, which also happens to be our first online event at some scale. The foundation, as many of you know here, is a charitable trust based in India, established in 2003. Its major objectives are to facilitate multidisciplinary theoretical and empirical inquiry in the field of agrarian studies in India, but also in other less developed countries. The research project titled Women's Work in Rural Economies has resulted into this book, which we number as sixth in the Agrarian Studies series. And it makes me very happy to see that all of those who were part of the foundational meeting of the book and of the project that took place at the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation in Chennai are present here and have been deeply and closely associated with the whole journey of the project and resulting into this book. On behalf of the foundation, let me once again thank you all for tagging along. Before we formally begin the proceedings, let me recall what Shri Hanan Mullah, the General Secretary of the All India Kisan Sabha, had told me over a phone call when I was trying to persuade him to join the international conference on this theme that was organized in 2018. He said, Kisan Sabha fights against feudal forces, but such tendencies within the movement are still to be won over. This is particularly true on the question of women. These were truly encouraging words which reassured us of the value of our research, and I sincerely hope that this book will keep being useful for the progressive movement in the country. Let me now call upon Professor V.K. Ramachandran, Vice Chairperson, State Planning Board, Government of Kerala, and Trustee of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, and editor of this book, and also of the Review of Agrarian Studies, our flagship, the flagship journal of the Foundation, and also the series editor of the Agrarian Studies series. Ram.
Thank you very much, Sandeepan. Welcome to all the panelists. It's wonderful to see you all here. Thank you and welcome to our authors and other colleagues who are also in the Zoom room but not on screen. And welcome to all of those listening to this program on social media sites. This book has actually, Sandeepan, a slightly longer history than that. At the 10th anniversary conference of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, which was held in Kochi in 2004, one observation to activist leaders who are in this panel, one of the comments was that there really wasn't enough on women in rural production in the conference. And actually that was, of course, it was a criticism of the conference, but it was also a criticism of the literature as it then was. The study of women in rural India there's a great deal of study. There are many. There's much work on that. There's a great and flourishing and honorable literature in the field. But it was not. But it concentrated on issues of living standards, freedoms, civil liberties, and a range of issues, but it didn't concentrate on production in the way that, that we thought was necessary, and which our academic colleagues and comrades thought was necessary as well. So we promised in the closing session of that conference that give us 5 years, we'll do a book on this, on women and work in rural India. And it was 5 years, 4 years and a bit, when we had the conference, which was inaugurated by Brinda and by Brinda Karat. Yeah? And it's taken us slightly longer than we thought from the conference to produce a book, but now the book has been produced, and it is here for you. This is some of the background to the book. I'm going to end by saying that part of the book, I know all of you are going to discuss the content of the book, but it took shape after the inaugural speech by Brinda, where a basic myth of academics was, in the very first part of her inaugural speech, knocked it down. This idea that women are voluntarily withdrawing from the labor force. And Brinda was very clear on how women were forced out of the labor force because they didn't work. Now, I know that's going to be a major part of the discussion today, but it's been years in the preparation, we're really happy to have all of you here for this release ceremony. Thank you all. Thank you, Sandeep, and thank you
all. Thank you, Ram. So I think you have said what I was thinking of saying now, thanking the continuous support and efforts of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung who have supported this project from its inception, TNQ Technologies for the product design, and our publishers Tulika Books. And I'm happy that all of them could be here with us today. Before we go for the formal release, may I request Vinod Koshti, project manager who is representing the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia, to share his experience of this long and steady journey with the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. Vinod?
Yeah, thank you, Sandeepan. And on behalf of RLS, I won't take much of time, but on behalf of RLS, I convey my immense pleasure in handing over this book to Comrade Brinda. RLS has always been committed towards fostering better understanding on the agrarian relations in India. And we have always, the gender has always been on a special attention in our mind when whatever we do in our work. So we are thankful to Foundation for Agrarian Studies, who have done immense work on research, and we salute the rigor which they maintain in their research work and their connection with the mass organizations and the way they contribute to the understanding and strategies of the mass struggles. I am very happy to be part of this endeavor. I am very happy to be part of this book release function. And I congratulate the entire team of FAS who has brought out such a nice publication. Thank you, Sandeepan.
May I now request Indu Chandrasekhar, Managing Director, Tulika Books, and Vinod to jointly hand over the first copy to Ms. Brinda Karat, patron and former General Secretary of the All India Democratic Women's Association and Politburo member of the Communist Party of India Marxist, who would then formally release the book. Vinod and Indu.
Such an immense pleasure. Comrade Brinda Karat, please release the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Over to you, Brinda.
Thank you so very much. And here we have the formal release of this wonderful book, Women and Work in Rural India. There you are.
I now invite Ms. Brinda Karat to deliver the keynote address.
Thank you so very much, Sandeepan. And congratulations for organizing the very first, in my whole life, this is the very first online receipt of a book done so smoothly, for which I have to thank you, including the packaging, which was absolutely bang on. So thank you very much, Sandeepan. My very dear friends, I'm most happy and privileged also to be part of the release of the book, Women and Work in Rural India, edited by Madhura Swaminathan, Shruti Nagbhushan, and V.K. Ramachandran. It meets the highest standards of publishing, as Ramachandran has so correctly stated, including designing and layout. And I would also like to add my congratulations to Tulika and especially Indu Chandrasekhar, and equally to Mariam Ram and her team at TNQ for this publication. Tulika is also celebrating the 25th year of the publication of its first book, and I would like to therefore use this occasion to greet Indu and her colleagues for this great achievement. This release, it happens in unusual times of a semi-lockdown triggered by a pandemic, which, because of government policies in this period, has intensified social and economic inequalities with the most devastating impact on the lives and livelihood of the subjects of the book, the working women in rural India today. The tragic death due to starvation and dehydration of an Adivasi teenager, Jamlo, you must have read about her, who had gone to a neighboring state to pick chilies as a worker in a group contract with other women, or the death of Amina Begum due to hunger and exhaustion. She was a migrant worker returning from Gujarat. They are both representative of the reality of rural women and working children, short-term migrants, millions of them across India. And yet, when India was forced to acknowledge the existence of over 12 crore migrant workers, the experience of women migrant workers was missing. Why should this be so? It reflects the invisibilization of women's work, and especially the work of poor rural women. This in turn is intrinsically linked to the undercounting as well as the underestimation of women's work on the one hand, as well as a policy-driven refusal to recognize the deep problem of unemployment and underemployment of rural women and their demand for work. Now, the writings in this book, which we have just released, they understand and address the huge gaps in the official approach to women's work in rural India. The book presents an insightful analysis of the world of rural women's work and its multiple layers. I was able, over the last 2 days, to have a quick first reading. I'll have to go into it much deeper, but a quick first reading of the book. And having read it, I want to thank with all my heart and without any exaggeration, the editors and the authors, and say to them, every essay in this book spoke to me, as it will to all those in the epic battle for gender equality and social change. The book effectively challenges the myth of poor rural women, not only landless manual workers, and this is an important point for all of us, not just landless manual workers or agricultural workers or non-agricultural rural women workers, but poor peasant and middle peasant women too. The myth of them having a choice not to work, that is, women opt out of work because they can. Now, this is just not true. And the studies published in the volume provide hard evidence of this. I believe because of the combined efforts of scholars, researchers, gender studies, women's organizations, their movements, their analysis, we have moved ahead in the whole process of understanding more about women's work. And I think all these combined efforts have been reflected to some extent in the ILO 2013 resolution, which does recognize hitherto invisibilized work, as for example, domestic work that women do, which is now defined as work. And this is very clearly put in the essay that Indira Hidway's article in this book. But the question, I mean, which comes through my experience, however limited it is, that how do you actually measure or count or categorize the multiple tasks and work that a woman does? For example, you take an Adivasi woman in India today. She could be a peasant, a gatherer of forest produce, a short-term migrant worker, a Manrega worker, also a construction worker, also doing domestic work, unpaid domestic work, also self-employed, perhaps through poultry work or taking care of cattle, all within 365 days of a year, multiple roles. So in which category would we put her? Would we put her as would she be counted as a worker? Would she be counted as being self-employed? Would she be counted as being involved in own use production? Or would she be counted as selling, being part of the market? In other words, employed according to the ILO definition? Or would she be an unpaid worker? So the thing is, friends, that the crisis engendered and created by capitalism in livelihoods and the crisis of livelihoods, and the consequent strategies adopted by poor women, make it difficult in the Indian context to accurately categorize a woman's work, even if we use the improved methods of ILO. And one aspect which we need to take into account is all this is under a cloud of uncertainty. You are not to work today or tomorrow or a week from now. So there's no planning either. So this cloud, this dark cloud of uncertainty in the lives of women who have no alternative but to work, and the hours that she spends in searching for work, all this also needs to be taken into account. And therefore, I believe that one of the critical contributions of FAS is the use of time use surveys. Of course, there are small time use surveys which have been used in this publication for quite a profound analysis, according to me. But I believe that the use of the methodology of time use surveys to actually count accurately, if you have a properly designed survey, which it will include ILO categories and also the categories which have been mentioned in the book by 3 authors, augmented work participation of women. So if we can design something, we means not, I'm not talking about FS, I'm talking about official surveys, time use surveys. I think that is a very critical aspect which we have to take up as far as the women's movement is concerned. Of course, we have to get the ILO resolution implemented. That's one big thing. But also this issue of time use survey, which I believe reading through, just came to me that in our work also, although we don't have that kind of rigorous survey work, but time use is so critical to understanding the multiple tasks of women. And this is one aspect. And of course, you're working in a regime where this government is horrified and terrorized by accurate data. I'm going more on to that, but in spite of the fact that this government is not interested in data, we have to continue with the struggle to ensure that these things are done. Another point which has come out clearly in this book, which also speaks to us, and that is that we don't see rural women as a homogeneous community. And class differentiation among rural women, it also questions our easy use of the term rural women. Because if you look at class differentiation, yes, there are rural women and rural women. And the experiences are quite different. So one of the issues, I think, which has come out very significantly in this book, and that is in an essay authored by V.K. Ramachandran, in which I think for the first time, the method is not using the household as a unit, but individual members, e.g. men and women as individual units, and trying to trace through data and understanding the changes that capitalism has wrought in the lives of the peasantry in rural India and in the process of proletarianization. Now, this is a debate which has been going on for a long time, with feminist scholars saying that Marxist analysis does not sufficiently look at men and women differently, etc. I'm not going into that at all, and I don't agree with many of the formulations of that debate, the way it was posed. But I think this is a more significant contribution of looking at proletarianization and the different impact and distinctive features of men and women. And I just want to add, I mean, I don't know, but it just seems to me that when we look at this, it is the first time it's being done. I'm sure this will lead to more such studies, but does the role, for example, of the lack of land ownership of a woman in a small peasant or a middle peasant household, the lack of ownership of land, how does that impact on this process of proletarianization? If a woman is hiring out her labor more than she is expending on her own farm, is one of the startling things which have come in this essay of Rami's, of V.K. Ramachandran's. So how would this impact on an assessment of a distinctive feature? Because you're working on your own farm, you're hiring out your labor. Along with that, you are doing SNA, extended SNA activities. So the process of proletarianization of a middle peasant male and a female, or a small peasant male and a female, how is that dictated to by the hours of work and the burden of work? The third aspect also, which has been raised in two essays by Arindam Das, the clear differentiation between male and women's earnings. So now when we talk about proletarianization, and both a middle peasant man and a woman are going out to hire out their labor, the woman is getting much less of a wage than the man is getting. How is that? Is that a distinctive feature or not? So I think this study, which has come in this essay, I think it's very significant for all of us. And I'm sure it will help us to go further on this way of separating, taking the household as a unit, certainly, but also separating to understand certain processes. Then, another very important aspect is the whole issue of women's work burden, which we have been dealing with. And now the new definitions are also adding more to it, SNA, extended SNA work, etc. My question is, when we talk about rural women and we talk about the impact of patriarchal practices and ideologies, which have a much wider impact generally in society as a whole, how far does being a rich peasant woman influence the hours of work, the burden of work, and how far are we able to differentiate between extended SNA and unpaid women's work, in particular, unpaid women's work, including domestic work, among the different classes of women in rural India? Now, Madhura Swaminathan's piece on this, in which she's looking at through time use surveys, and I mean, I was absolutely shocked with some of those findings in which a woman is doing 91 hours of work, if you include SNA, extended SNA, domestic work, different types of work, 91 hours. And I don't think this is just one of a kind. I think this represents a reality of the most horrendous kind of work. But I would be interested to know, because it affects strategy also. What is the kind of work burden? I'm talking through facts and use surveys, not through impressionistic things. But can we do, and can we compare, and can we have further studies of the differentiation as far as, because I mean, common sense would say if she's got a bigger income, she'd prefer to hire in female labor and not do domestic work, or not do, if she has the money, as a woman of a rich peasant household. But frankly, given the crisis all over in agrarian India, we can't be sure of this. So I think when you look at class differentiation, this aspect, we would really like some more light and to help our strategies if we can find out the differences, because we all talk about work burden, unpaid work, but what is the differentiation class-wise? I think that would be, we get a glimpse of it in this essay, but I think it would be just wonderful. Then very quickly, when we talk about the shrinkage of women's employment and, the very few employment avenues in non-agricultural work, I think the whole issue posed by Comrade Hemlata, as far as 8 million women, a large number of them in rural India, in scheme work, and what are the kind of, work conditions, what is the minimum wage, nothing. So this also has to be taken into account when we are looking at rural women's work and how to integrate these struggles. Because after all, an ASHA worker could be a middle peasant woman, she could be a rural peasant, a poor peasant household, she could be an Adivasi. So to link up also scheme workers in this, in non-agricultural work, from that aspect, apart from her being part of the working class, I think this is important. And I really love Manrega in this book because I tell you, this Manrega, of course it's a lifeline, we all know that. But I tell you, the measurement of women's work in Manrega, they have stopped doing time use surveys. Therefore, whether the soil, when she's doing earthwork, whether what kind of hard soil, soft soil, what kind of soil, we have been in Tamil Nadu and seen women spending 1 hour getting water to loosen the soil before she can do earthwork. So what is this work? And how do we measure it? And is it not a most important issue to have a movement for redesigning Manrega? Not the way Modi government wants to do it, but from make it more women friendly and to ensure that, because at present, I tell you, it is fraudulent. It is a cheat on women because they cannot get a minimum wage according to the high productivity standards of piece rate or contract work which they are getting under Manrega. So that also is a thing that we have to look at. Then one thing, and which I really appreciate about FAS, is from the beginning, the integration of an understanding of caste and the caste system in understanding agrarian relations. Now, I know, and as part of our movement, I'm only talking about the movement I'm involved in, we have found a quite mechanical understanding that mobilization on class issues has a spontaneous role in building organic unity, breaking caste barriers. Of course, it's true that class struggle does play that role of unity in unifying, and that's why they're trying to break it through various things, which I'm not discussing today. But that comes only if you identify consciously the specific issues of Dalit and Adivasi women. And this essay by Professor Thorat and Khalid Khan in this, it gives you that brutal picture of when we talk about lack of choice of women, the lack of choice generically for Dalit and Adivasi women, what is the choice? Caste, birth, based nature of work to a great extent. And this comes out to a very sharply in this essay and also in your book on the FAS book on Dalit lives and livelihood. But just one quick point, that is, see, when we look at the nature of Dalit work or Adivasi work, most of the work is through contractors, whether they are short-term migrants, whether they are construction workers, whether they're doing cleaning or sanitation work. The nature of the work for a large section of Dalit and Adivasi women, non-agricultural work, is work which by its very nature of the contract or the nature of the relationship between the employer and the worker puts her every single day in the most vulnerable work situation. So I think we do need special efforts to address these issues of the working conditions of Dalit and Adivasi women. And here's a demand for FAS. You've done a wonderful work with Dalit women, but the proletarianization of Adivasi women and what is happening as far as displacement, land, disasters are concerned, I think we do need a separate book on the issues of Adivasis and specifically on Dalits. And finally, on the issue of financial inclusion. And Pallavi's contribution in that. In our experience, exactly, this is so true, because earlier, India had played such a huge role now in this whole self-help movement and helping women, income, livelihood, some extra income, and particularly for the women that we are talking about. But given the whole neoliberal framework of policies and the squeezing of credit, the takeover of banks by, what is happening is it's being replaced by MFIs with the most exploitative, high interest, the worst kind of modern money lending. I'm sorry to say this, even in this COVID time, one of the biggest things in boost is through credit, through MFIs. But I tell you, this kind of money, modern money lending, the worst kind of usury which is there in today's modern India. And this is an issue, I think, which is addressed and we need to. So I conclude by saying that in all this work that we have been doing, we have been so strengthened by the rigorous analysis presented by these studies of the FAS. And I believe in all these publications, this publication in particular has a very, very unique contribution. And in particular, the integrated understanding of how social relations of class, caste, and gender operate to ensure the maximization of profit for the exploiter. And this understanding in all your publications, we cannot succeed in our fundamental struggle against capitalism without this. So I thank you. We have a lot of work to do. We are living in difficult times. We are living in challenging times. We are also living in times which have tremendous potential. And if we can indeed unleash the huge potential of this energy, resistance, and the work done by rural women and the exploitation that they face, and if we can release the energy that they have in fighting that, we'll be much closer to our goal of social change and fundamental justice for all these sections. So I thank you very much indeed. Thank you, FAS, and thank you to all the editors and authors of this book.
Thank you, Ms. Brinda.
Good afternoon, everybody. And as I was thinking of what to say today, I realized that when you are sending a book off to press, you just think of all the things that have been left out and that need to be done. So to all the young researchers or young people listening in, I think this book has raised a lot of questions, and there's still a lot of gaps, and there are many things that still need to be done. Just to give so start with this, if we take Professor Youshafi Usami's calculation in our volume of the augmented work participation rate, that is using the official statistics, the official work participation rate based on principal and subsidiary status, and then adding women who were in specific activities like home gardening, kitchen gardening, dairying, care of livestock, and so on. Roughly, going by the 2011 census, and it must be more now, 192 million women in rural India are workers. Now, how many workers are there in the IT sector? We have so many studies on IT industry. We're talking about a few million. And here we're talking about 200 million. I'm talking about adult women. I'm talking about women above the age of 15. So I think, in a way, what is very humbling is that this is, we've addressed only a handful of issues that there's much more to study, because the people we are talking about, as Brinda Karat mentioned, is the women in rural India are really an enormous, both in absolute sense and relative sense, part of our workforce, and will have to be part of any process of development or social change in this country. Let me say a few words about the time use study that we did through the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. It's very small and it's in 2 villages of Karnataka. But I think there were 2 unique features about it. The first is that we did a survey, 24-hour recall survey, which is what a time use survey does, ask all the activities in the last 24 hours. But we did this for 7 days continuously. And this has not been done before internationally anywhere. Secondly, we did it across seasons, so that, because we know that in the rural economy, opportunities for work and employment vary hugely by season. Lean season, sowing season, harvest season, and so on. And what was, I think the scale of this study is very small, but what has emerged is we could actually calculate extent of women's work participation only in economic activity. I'm not even talking about domestic work right now, using a current weekly status definition. That is, we could look at the last 1 week of the survey and ask, what was your major time spent on? So we could use the official classification and definition and concept, but apply it to this data. And the answer, not surprisingly, is that in the harvest season, when work is available, almost every woman is a worker. I mean, this is no surprise to those who have traveled and lived in rural areas, as many of our activist friends have. And there were only 1 or 2 women, one from a rich capitalist family, a woman who did not engage in work outside the house, and a second was somebody who had a child with disabilities that needed full-time care. Now, this is the context that I think what we started talking about at the conference, what Brinda mentioned and she mentioned today, is that when we say women's work participation is low or it's declining or women are not in the workforce, it's because of the lack of employment. Now, what we observe always is a combination of demand and supply factors, and it's complex, varies by region, and there are many nuances to it. You know, there may be older women who have certain preferences, women with certain levels of education or income and so on. But I think academics, here I'm addressing the academics who may be listening in, get tied in on regressions or other means of sort of saying how important are demand and supply factors, when what is staring us in the face is that the huge problem, the first and most important problem, is the demand side. In other words, lack of employment opportunities. And so I think, if anything, this is one message that is coming out of the book, at least for me, and this is reflected in many of the other studies. For example, the work on NREGA by Smita Rao and Smriti Rao and Smita Ramnarayan in our volume and elsewhere, women are more than 50% of NREGA workers. So there was a quota of 1/3 for women workers, but they are coming forth for more work. So again, this is another indicator of the lack of employment available to them. So we can start piecing together the picture of the huge crisis of employment in rural areas from several of the chapters of the book. And I hope those listening in will contribute more to further study this. A lot of points have already been made, so I won't talk about other issues, except one which deals with the wages. Again, the work of Professor Usami, which has been extended by Arindam in this book. And that is that the gap between male and female wages now is highest in the sector, the non-agricultural sector of rural employment. There is a gap in agricultural operations as well, but as men move from agriculture to non-agriculture, the gap widens. So again, I think this was, reflects what was being said perhaps earlier by our keynote speaker, that, the new opportunities which are at higher wages are not available to women. So they don't have easy access to non-agricultural employment, for a variety of reasons, such as, issues of safety, security, in traveling outside the village. And these are the opportunities being taken by men, and this is where the gender gap is actually widening. So I think there are issues here that we need to think about. It's not that in the modernized sectors of the economy, the wage gap is necessarily going to be lower than in the agricultural sector. So I'll stop with that because I want to hear the other participants and get comments and questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhura. So let me now tell the Hitesh or Nihira, whoever is planning to
Yes,
put
I'll
up
do
the
it.
video by Dr. K. Hemlata.
There are many aspects of women's work which needs, I think, research, more further research. Because in our country, we don't find much literature on that, though recently there are some studies and publications on the women's work. Scheme workers, actually, it is not a category of employment. We have categorized, we have brought together all the workers. Actually, they are not recognized as workers by the government. Those who are working in different schemes of the government of India, like the ICDS, like the NHM, and the Rural Livelihood Mission, then the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, then the National Child Labor Project. So there are so many different projects, and within the health aspect also, it is not only the ASHAs. There are different names given by the government, like Mamata and Yashoda. So very beautiful names. So Mamata is a woman who is assisting the women during their delivery time. So they are employed to work in the hospitals to help the women, to assist the woman who is in delivery, and then after for 3 days in the postnatal period, the child also. So that is why they are called Mamata and Yashoda, like a foster mother. So, but they are not paid any, they are not called workers, all these scheme workers. According to our estimate, there are at least 70 to 80 lakh women workers, and most of them are women. For example, you see the Anganwadi workers and helpers themselves are around 26 lakhs. The midday meal workers, that is another scheme of the government of India, they are around 26 lakhs. And in addition to that, lakhs of para teachers are there employed under the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. And then National Rural Livelihood Mission. They are also those organizers who are organizing the Dwakra groups and assisting them in getting loans and maintaining the accounts, etc. There are lakhs of women. And in addition, earlier there were the extension offices in agriculture. Now that is abolished, and they are called Raitu Mitra or like that in different states, like Krishak Sathi in Odisha, Raitu Mitra in Andhra, like that. And now there are Bank Mitras. Bank Mitras also, they are helping the regular employees. All these workers, they are not called workers. They are called either social workers, they are called activists, they are called mitras, guests, etc., etc. And thereby the government is avoiding payment of minimum wages by not recognizing them as workers. They are not paying minimum wages. Whenever we demand payment of minimum wages, they say that you are not workers, you are not eligible for that. And not only minimum wages, they don't have any social security, no pension. For example, Anganwadi workers and helpers, in this year, the scheme ICDS was started in 1975, now it is 45 years. And many of them have worked 25, 30, 35 years, but no pension. So this is the means mainly to avoid the minimum wages and the basic responsibility as an employer. The government is calling them social activists and not workers. So that is the plight of all these workers. And now, of course, in other sections, in other ways, it is being extended. For example, contract outsourcing, then employing temporary workers or apprentices. So in different names, and also executives. So just to avoid the status of workers, they call them social workers or executives. Also, they cannot be given the right to organize and right to collective bargaining, which are the basic things for a worker to fight for their rights. So this is what the government of India is doing, and that is why this name of skilled workers was given by the trade union movement to all these different sections of workers who are employed by the government of India but not recognized as workers. On the whole, what we find today is women's participation, particularly from the trade union angle. When we are organizing women, what we find today, our CITU's experience, is that more and more women are coming out in struggles. We may generally say, most of the research says that women's participation in trade union is very less. They are having so many problems while participating in trade union work, so that is why they are ready to come. But our experience is that when we try to reach out to them, they are facing many difficulties, but despite that, they are coming into struggles, and what we find is more militantly than men. It is that with a determination. So why is this is, I think, one of the questions that we need to ask and try to get the answers also. Because it is not easy for women to come. But despite that, they are participating in large numbers, and they are taking up responsibilities in the union, and not only in the union, but outside the union also, in organizing some other sections. Then why is it that they are doing this, and how they are able to cope up? What is the driving force that enable them to face all these difficulties and yet come out into struggles and participate in the trade union movement? That, because I am interested in that, because often many people ask the trade unions that what is the driving force, and generally women do not come like that. So I think much more research needs to be done on this aspect, whether it is the Anganwadi workers, the Ashas. Even recently, during the lockdown period, we found that large number of Anganwadi workers and helpers and Ashas who are in the forefront during this period, frontline workers, what they are being called. So they are the frontline workers going house to house and taking care, monitoring and all these things. So they have, because they are not paid, they are not even their regular wages are not paid. Not wages, of course, called what is that? Incentive. What Ashas are paid is called an incentive. Even that incentive is not being paid, not any extra money. So they are coming out into struggles. They have gone on strikes, they are on mobilizing despite all the lockdown protocols, restrictions, etc. So one of the features of this, we have been organizing protests since April 21st. And the latest one was on 9th August. Till today, all the programs, large number of women from Jammu, Kashmir. You can imagine in the Kashmir Valley how difficult it is for women to participate in the CITU's programs. And even there, from there to our traditional strongholds, they are participating in large numbers. Tulika publishers have been publishing many good books related to different aspects, the rural series, the agrarian studies, etc., etc. We are also taking help of the FAS from CITU. I thank Tulika publishers and also the FAS for all the help that they extend for our research. Because from CITU also, we are undertaking research on the rural workers, including the women workers, because in the rural areas, non-agricultural work is increasing. So that aspect we want to study. What are the different types of work that the rural people who are not engaged in agriculture? And recently the NABARD study also, not very recently, but some time back, the NABARD study also has indicated, they have told that the income from non-agriculture is more than the income from agriculture for large number of, most of the rural they are coming out to work. So how can we organize these non-agricultural rural workers is what we want to study. So I once again thank FIS for giving me this opportunity and also helping us in our research. And I conclude. Thank you.
Professor Judith, you may start your presentation.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, no, I just want to say that many of us, our participants, may not know that Dr. Judith Heyer was part of the planning of the inception of this book. So thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Madhura. I also wanted to say that I felt very honored to be part of the inception of a study which has turned out to be with such stunning results. So it was very, in the days when we were talking about how to do this, and we were emphasizing the time used surveys, I'm really pleased to see particularly how well that came out and how much that told us. And I think although it was a very small sample, it actually told us an awful lot, which shows how worthwhile these time use surveys are and how valuable it would be to extend them, as Brinda was saying. So I feel very impressed by the quality of the book, the quality of the research that's gone into this book, the quality of the production all around. And I think it's going to be incredibly useful for academics as well as for activists as well as for all sorts of people. I think it's also quite provocative because, as Madhura said, the moment you put together a book like this, you realize where are the gaps, what are the other things that we need to research, where are the new things that we need to find out because of what we have found out so far. So for me, one of the things I would start with stressing is certainly the material that shows so convincingly how hard rural women work in all sorts of capacities. And I think the class analysis is very, very valuable and needs to be stressed and needs to be brought out, and we need to be having all of our actions informed by this class analysis. That we can't just talk about rural women, we can't just talk about rural women's work, but we have to think differently about those that are in different class positions, and that means not leaving out the people who are somewhat better off than the manual workers. The other thing I think that we need to stress, or what came out for me so strongly and has done through my research, is that women who work so hard also do all the worst paid jobs and all the unpaid jobs. So it's the quality of the work that they are involved with and the pay, the remuneration that they're getting for what they're doing, which is as much of a problem as how much work they're doing. And I think we really need to stress that. One of the things that I have argued in some of the things that I have published, which goes very much against Brinda's plea, is that it's actually better for women to withdraw from some of the worst kinds of work than it is to continue doing those worst kinds of work. And it's come out very clearly in the research I've done among Dalit women in particular, that being able to do less agricultural labor has been regarded by them as a huge advance. And one of the things that's so sad is to listen to Dalit women saying, you know, at least now we're able to look after our families, at least now we can look after our children. We don't have to go out to work for quite so much time. So I think that we need to focus not just on whether women are getting work, but we don't want to force them into these awful kinds of work, which are in a way very exploitative, very oppressive, and sometimes more damaging than not working. And I really like the NREGA, one of the NREGA chapters in the book for that, because I think that putting that in the context of, you know, asking the question, why do so many women participate in NREGA work when we know that it's backbreaking, we know that it's tough and all the rest? We have to see that in the context of the fact that they have so little opportunity to do work of any value at all, so little opportunity to do work which is at all well paid or at all less backbreaking, and not moreover that they are still shouldering the responsibilities of having to keep their families going. So it's not only that they have so little opportunity to work, but that they are the ones that are responsible ultimately if the children don't have anything to eat and if the family is not able to survive. So going on from that then, I would like to say that I think the things on which I would particularly like to see further work, there are many such things, some of which other people have already mentioned, but I think one of the things that's really worth doing further research on is this wage gap problem. It's just incredible to think that women, certainly in the southern states and Tamil Nadu, which I know well, are paid often only 40% or 50% of what the men are being paid for the same work. And how to try to really understand how that can be possible and how that is possible and why that is possible and what are the underlying things we need to tackle in order to stop it from being possible. And that's where I think Arindam Das made a quite valiant effort to do some of the work on trying to explain that through correlation analysis. But I think we need to go much further into the general context in which women are so disadvantaged across the board through patriarchy of different kinds and the sorts of norms, culture, beliefs about what it is appropriate for women to do, what is not appropriate for women to do, and the sort of power and control within households to which they are subject. So whereas I agree that we need to focus quite a lot more on individuals and not just on households, I think we also need to focus a lot more on relations within households, the interactions between the different members of the households, which make it so difficult for women to break out of these norms and expectations of the things which are appropriate for them to do. And that, of course, takes us into the whole question about education, and education being, as we would all, I think, agree, vitally important for women. But the problem being that many of the rural women who are educated with at huge cost to their families, after huge struggles, are then relegated to acting as wives in households in which they can't use their education because of the strong social pressures on them. So I think these things all need to be brought together, and we need to try to understand the quality of work issue in the context of what's going on within households as well as outside. The other thing that I would stress is the whole question of domestic and unpaid work, sort of the huge burden which has been shown in so many of these different studies that women are bearing in the number of hours of work they're doing, is something on which we could focus more attention. Ways in which that burden itself could be made easier, ways in which women's work, domestic work, work within the household could be less burdensome. And I'm struck particularly, for example, in the areas that have very big problems with water. The amount of time that women have to spend waiting for the tankers, queuing for the water, getting their water pots filled, is one of the many areas which increases their burden of work enormously, or can do in some areas. But there are other things connected with domestic work which don't really get very much attention when it's generally thought that women can afford to spend this time, we don't worry about the time they spend. Accessing the PDS, for example, in Tamil Nadu, which is quite well provisioned as far as the PDS is concerned. The amount of time women often have to spend going, finding out whether the supplies have come, queuing to be first in the queue if they have come, etc., etc. So the domestic work within the household that women have to do is something we could also pay more attention to, making it less burdensome, making it less onerous. Now, the other thing I think that I would like to see much more work on is collective action. We've had people, including Hemlata just now, talking about and Brinda and Edward and all the different areas in which collective action has been taking place, but it's still very, very thin on the ground. The amount of organisation of women at the grassroots in villages that's taken place. Obviously, the most widespread has been through the microcredit schemes, but they have, in many areas, not really taken us very far. And just trying to get more region by region, area by area, village by village, more organisation among women to allow them to address, to express what their real big problems are, to address some of the problems that they're facing. Seems to me something that could take us much further than it has. And what I would love to see here is more publication, more research, more work showing where and in what circumstances this has been effective in achieving what. Because collective action amongst women in different parts of the country clearly has achieved a fair amount in some circumstances, but in other parts it's achieved very little. Now, the other thing, how am I on time?
Yeah, it's just about time, maybe a minute more.
I just want 1 minute then at the end to say, COVID-19. One of the most depressing things that I've been reading about recently from work coming out of the French Institute in Pondicherry is the way in which rural people, but rural women in particular, have been coping with COVID-19, running down all their savings, all their lines of credit, all their relationships which they built up with such care in the past, reverting to feudal relationships, reverting to dependency, setting them back a huge amount from where they had struggled to get. So I hope that all of us will be continuing to do the work which will take us forward in the longer run, but also recognize that this COVID disaster has been a huge disaster for rural women, a huge setback for things that have been achieved hitherto in rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Judith. So I'll now invite Ms. Mariam Dhawale.
Thank you, Sandeepan, and congratulations for bringing out this very important book. A book, as Comrade Brinda rightly said, that even when we were listening to the introduction about this book and hearing about certain aspects to it, and when going through it, it really looked like as if finally somebody is saying something about what ADWA has been talking for such a long time. So it is, we are very, very grateful to FAS and all the writers, authors, and everybody who have made this possible. The issue of women's work in the rural areas, this has various aspects to it. You see, one thing is there that in the book also it is mentioned, the whole landlessness and the mechanization that has taken place, that has forced the rural population who were earlier involved in only agricultural activities to go into non-agricultural activities. Now, this is one part, but it is not the only part. You see, women, the whole issue of women, how they have got pushed into insecure conditions, and also the increase of the burden of women. As rightly pointed out earlier, women are not just doing non-agricultural work per se as such. Women are just working and working and working to somehow managing to survive. Now, I will not go into a lot of details, but what is happening in the rural areas and in the non-agricultural sector, both the sectors, women are at a loss, because in the rural areas, they are really not recognized as farmers. Because, you know, when you think of farmers, it's always the male image that comes. And that's also where they are deprived of their rights. And secondly, even as workers, if you see, they are not really recognized as workers. And so there also their devaluation takes place. Now, we have seen that in many places. I'll just go point by point because of lack of time. I'll rush up a bit. In Andhra Pradesh, for example, when we saw the whole issue of construction workers, when ADWA was going amongst construction workers, because they were also linked to the rural areas. So both the sides, we had contact with them. what did we find? That the construction workers, the women construction workers, were not actually recognized as workers. They were like helpers. They were just told as helpers, and there was no registration of any kind of the women who were working on that site. And because of that, they had no access to any of the benefits that were given by the boards. There are boards set up for construction workers. Usually women are counted as co-workers or joint labor. They come with the men folk. There you see, for example, making of the cement. The man is making the cement, the woman is just carrying it and taking it across. So it's like a joint labor. So her separate entity as a labor doesn't recognize. And that's why registration of workers, when they are being done, when the men are being registered, why are women not being registered? Why is this bias there in the registration process? That needs to be looked into. When the second issue is regarding the migratory workers. You see, there are seasonal migration going on everywhere. Now, in the seasonal migration, it includes a lot of women. Now, the ADWA has been trying to intervene on the issues of these women. What have we found? See, there are, why does this seasonal migration take place? Actually, if you really go to see, most of the seasonal migratory families, they are all in huge debts. They are totally drowned in loans, and they are no better than bonded labor. As Comrade Brinda rightly pointed out, the bondage is with this contractor. And the contractor, the employment depends on the physicality of the contractor. There is no system by which this works. Now, the seasonal migration also, they really do not get anything in hand much because they're already in loans. So how do they really survive? They don't survive. They just go to work in a particular spot for a particular, for some period of time, just to survive. They don't come back with any kind of monetary gain. So it is just a survival struggle going on every time. The third part is when you talk of mechanization, you see, mechanization in a way it makes women lose their jobs, yes. But when the women were actually working on the field, what we have found that it is not linked only to working on the field and getting a particular amount of payment. There are a lot of aspects with that. So mechanization makes them lose their jobs, makes them lose their work, but it doesn't do only that. For example, when they're doing harvesting, then the remains that is there, the waste, most of the women take that for fodder. Now, if that is not available to them, then they have to go much more longer periods to search for fodder. So that is the labor which increases. In some parts, we have found that during the harvest season, some amount of grain is given to that woman to take home. That grain, again, she is denied because of the mechanization. So she has to, as Judith ma'am said, that then she has to rush for this whole free food grains or cheap food grains, and you know how the whole PDS is working in our country. So that is there are these different aspects, fallouts of mechanization that also need to be looked into. The fourth part regarding the land. Now, this is a very complicated scenario. There are various aspects to it. Now, one is land in occupation. For example, in the tribal areas, land in occupation, when that land is taken over. Now, you know, in most of these struggles, why do we find women coming out so intensely? It is the women who lead most of these struggles also in tribal areas especially. Is because they know that they have nothing else except that small piece of land. So when that land is taken over, they get no compensation, they are thrown out, and sometimes the land is in the man's name. So ultimately, the woman does not really get anything. Second part is the common lands. You know, there are common lands in villages. There some lands are restricted for grazing. those lands are also now being taken over by landlords or by the panchayats who are controlled by the landlords. Now in Haryana, for example, a very big issue of grazing lands came up. If grazing lands are taken over, and usually animals are looked after by the women or the children, they are told to, take the animals for grazing. Now at such times, then the woman has to walk longer periods, go much further to take these animals for grazing, and this increases the burden of animal husbandry borne by the women. The third part is withdrawal of the natural resources, right to natural resources. Now this creates a tremendous, enormous burden of workload on women, where they have to put in many extra hours of labor. It is everything. I mean, it's not just one thing. It's water, it's firewood, or it's everything. Now, for example, now here also, if you see the opportunities for work or for some kind of income, you now many of these rivers, you see some of these rivers are privatized. And we had done a study also, Comrade Brinda and Edwa and all of us, of the river that was given over to the Coca-Cola company in Maharashtra. Now that river was being used for some part of that water. One was washing of vessels and clothes, and second for growing vegetables. Now that river was given over to Coca-Cola, and the women were denied the rights to use that water. It was their water, but they were denied the rights. So the entire vegetable growing goes. The woman has to go much further to wash the vessels and the clothes. So her labor increases and her income is gone. And Coca-Cola does not employ them. So they have lost out, they've lost the land, the water, and everything. And imagine the pauperization that takes place. Same thing now, you see, even in these areas, the issue of Manrega. EDWA has intervened in many places to get women enrolled for job cards, because women were not being given job cards. And here too, we have seen that now in a study in Maharashtra, we found that women are, yes, rightly, women go in very large numbers for Manrega work. They go because they need that local work. But there is a catch. You see, even thus, when we were doing the study, again, Edwa was doing a study, and Brinda also was involved in that, which she mentioned in her thing, that here also many places, most of them, they ask for a combined labor. Means the man has to get the woman of the house for the work. That the woman's work is not identified separately. It is a payment that is given combined. Now here, that piece rate work, that measurement of digging that hole, that woman is carrying thousands of kilos of mud from that place of digging to be thrown out at some distance. And yes, just 2 minutes. And then what happens, that calculation of that woman's labor is just not taken into account. That means that is totally free labor, and that time that she spends, the energy that she spends, is just not looked into.
Amit, you may start your presentation, please.
Thanks, Sandeepan, and thank you to the FAS team for having me. This is the end of a lot of presentations. There's really not much that I have to add. I think pretty much everything that I would have said has been said already. First, let me congratulate FAS for producing this volume. I think everything that people have said, in the last hour and a half, absolutely wholeheartedly second that. It's an amazing book. I've had the chance to look at some chapters a little bit closely, others I've just skimmed. But I think most things have been said. Now let me just focus on one big picture thing, which is what can we learn for developing a better understanding, a theoretical understanding of the Indian economy from the immense amount of work that has gone into this volume. I think that's what I would like to spend just a few minutes doing. There's a wealth of information in there, including primary and secondary data sources, as we've already seen. But there's not just information, there's also very interesting conceptual observations that have been made. Things that have been alluded to. For example, Professor V.K. Ramachandran's chapter on production relations seen from the point of view of gender, Arindam's work on gender wage gap and so on. There's a lot of interesting conceptual work and empirical work. What I want to basically highlight sort of to people who might be listening, particularly young researchers and so on who might be listening in, is the book gives us a lot of good food for thought on understanding what is happening microeconomically and macroeconomically in India today. Understanding the theoretical, at the theoretical level, what is going on. So, for example, at the microeconomic level, the relationship between labor supply and wage rates, and particularly male and female wages, and the disparity between them. This is a very interesting thing that we need to think about. How do we model this? What are the factors that are going in? What makes gender wage gaps so hugely varied across India? Going all the way from 50% of male wage rates to 95% of male wage rates. Is it about the type of work that is going on, irrigated versus non-irrigated? Is it about patriarchal relations that pre-exist in some of these states which are different from other states? These are all factors that come up in the book, but what I'm saying is that there's a lot of good food for thought in developing theory on all of these issues. How do we understand the linkages here? And there are many moving parts, which is why we need a sophisticated understanding that draws on cultural aspects, that draws on ecological, agroecological aspects, as well as things that we usually would think of, such as types of occupations and so forth. So that's a micro example of how much rich information there is in the book for us to think about what's going on in the economy. At the macro, what I would highlight is what is the nature of structural change in India, right? Particularly in the last 20 years or so, the structural transformation that has happened, and it's a profound one, it's a complicated one. So we see that there is a huge prevalence of wage labor in the economy right now. So from a certain unproblematic mode of production type of a view, it's a capitalist economy. Because wage labor is hugely prevalent, all the way down to the various classes of the peasantry. So not only do landless or marginal farmers perform wage labor, but also middle farmers and small farmers perform wage labor. There's a hiring in, a hiring out, and an own labor happening on the farm all the time. And that makes for a very complicated mode of production. Now, what is the nature of this structural transformation is the question. Are we actually moving as, in some sort of simple teleological sense, you would have thought, right, of a Lewisian or a Kuznets type of transition occurring? There is some evidence for that, because you do see an increasing prevalence of non-agricultural work. You do see a movement away from family mode of production to wage labor and so on. So these things are happening. But on the other hand, I think most of us feel intuitively that this is not the kind of transformation or transition that we had in mind, or that Lewis or Kuznets might have had in mind. So where does it differ? What are precisely the theoretical ways in which India offers a different example? And I'm not saying that it's unique to India. I mean, this could be happening in many other countries. But Jayan has pointed to the lack of job creation. Many others have talked about the lack of modern sector job creation. And in the absence of that, where do people end up going when they leave family farms, particularly women? Because as we just saw in the past 1.5 hours, patriarchal relations will well, I shouldn't say inevitably, because this is a political thing, there's nothing inevitable, but will predictably result in men availing of the scarce opportunities that exist in the non-agricultural economy, particularly the formal economy, the modern economy. So men will avail of those. And then what happens to women is complicated. Do they withdraw from backbreaking agricultural work, something that Professor Judith Heyer was talking about, something that could be welcomed, right? That you don't have to do certain kinds of work anymore. Or are they shut out of opportunities? And so they are withdrawing for the wrong reasons. So these are not easy to discern unless you do the kind of careful work that FAS is doing. And this is actually a very big cautionary note in using secondary data, because secondary data doesn't tell you many of these things. And you often don't have the other covariates that you would like to put in your regressions to clearly identify why this is happening. So here's why primary data is very useful. So this kind of richness, I think, provides a lot of food for thought for both macro theory and micro theory. That's what I mainly wanted to say, which I thought would add a little bit more to the excellent summaries that have gone ahead of me. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we start with the question answer session, I'm very happy to say that we have with us now Jacob Littman, who he has recently joined the call, and he's the new office head of RLS New Delhi, and who is going to take charge of the office from 1st September 2020.
Thank you very much. Either way, I'm fine with it. It's Jacob, or in Germany would say Jakob, but I've been living in the Philippines for the last 3 years, where they also rather say Jacob, where in Indonesia they would say Jakob. So I'm all good. Okay, so Jakob has worked on issues of labor and worker rights, and we are very happy that you could join in the call for a minute. And would you like to say something before we start with the question answer session? Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, for giving me the opportunity. I joined the call since the very beginning, but I only joined now visible for you, for the audience. I'm happy to see some familiar faces because I've been working with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung already starting 2014, and I'm very happy to see you again and to working with you in the future. And I would like to thank all the panelists and the authors and FAS as a whole. I think it's very obvious the relevance of the issue these days, even more so. And I think, as Comrade Brinda Karat said, like the importance of data, it's really such an important issue and aspect. We will need to focus further on it. So I just feel very happy having the chance, even though this is officially still my onboarding period, as you mentioned, until next Tuesday, when I will officially head the regional office in Delhi. So this was a very nice introduction, a very nice teaser also for my upcoming work, and I'm really looking forward getting more into the topics and the cooperation with many of you. Thank you very much.
So the first question is for Madhura Swaminathan, which says that women taking care of children is considered in the data for the book as labor, and that's a question mark, since taking care of children, care work, is always seen as women's job in a social setting, and women give up their regular jobs to take care of the children. So I think the question is that how do we consider care work as labor? That's the question that, the first question that has come your way.
Yeah, so we have used the classification that is suggested by the United Nations and the ILO, where certain kinds of activities are called economic activities, that is in the system of national accounts. And then there's another set of activities like childcare, cooking, household maintenance, which are crucial to the reproduction of the household. So they are called extended SNA. And in some countries, they have even been valued because if there's I think at least that's what I learned years ago. Adam Smith said, if a man marries his cook, the GDP goes down. So there is a question of valuing the women's work in childcare, etc. But in my strict definition of women's work participation, I have not counted it. I've counted the hours engaged in care work and reported that.
Yeah. See, the next question for Professor Judith says, you mentioned that Dalit women said that they can give time to their children and family by not going to work. Thus, as husbands' incomes increase, earnings increase, they can choose not to work. Is that a choice, or is it due to patriarchy that they are not allowed to work? I mean,
the answer is that, judging from the way in which women express this, it's very much a choice which they are very pleased to be able to make. But it's in the context of Tamil Nadu, which had at that time quite generous PDS and other support in place, which made it possible to feed their families without them having to go out to work. And just a general point, when I made this point in one or two seminar presentations, I've had a very positive response from Dalit women saying that they really appreciate people understanding that they too care for their families and care for their children just like any of the rest of us. And that the idea of being allowed to be proud of what their children are doing and proud of the care they can give them is very important. In the study that I've been doing in Tamil Nadu over the longer term since the early 1980s, there's been an enormous change in the way in which Dalits present their children, relate to their children, and I'm arguing not only are children now thought to be important and important for the future, but that is increasing women's status because the women are seen as being crucial to the future of their children. But there's a whole lot of additional points that could be made there.
Okay, let me then go to the next question, which is for Amit. The question says, what could be the possible reasons for the gender wage gap? Now that's a big one, especially that justification, especially the system. Okay, okay. I'll also go to the next question, which says, how successful are employment generation schemes in providing employment for women? I think, yeah, these are two questions. What could be the possible reasons you see for gender wage gap, and how successful are the official employment generation schemes? Amit?
Okay, I'm not sure why I should get the first question. I don't feel particularly able.
yeah, you may choose to just look at the second one.
I mean, I'm sure many people would want to can say better than me. The gender wage, there are many reasons, including occupational segregation, industrial segregation, but also patriarchy, things that economists love to talk about, education and human capital. I mean, you can go on about this, right? So there are many institutional, individual reasons, structural reasons. But on the second question, that's actually a more, that's sort of interesting also to talk about in the context of the book, because as we saw, the Manrega example is a particularly striking one of where initially it was thought that, you might want to have some quota because women might not turn up, and then they turned up, much in excess of the quota. Now, of course, there could be many things going on here, including a simultaneous increase in non-agricultural employment opportunities for men in the rest of the economy, which then means that women take up Narega work and so forth. So it's not clear, it's not the interpretation of why Manrega has a lot of women working in it in certain areas is not straightforward. It could be many reasons behind it. The second reason why this question is actually relevant for the book is the excellent chapter on the scheme workers, which was a real eye-opener for me, at least. Not only in terms of the number of workers, but the other information there in terms of what they do, the kinds of work that they do, how much they work, and so forth. So in all of these cases, I think it's clear that the government has actually played a very big role in creating what is essentially a very large workforce, an unacknowledged workforce, right? Because for democratic pressures or whatever other reasons, we've had a significant amount of welfare schemes being introduced over the years, ICDS, midday meals, ASHA, many other kinds of things. Now, for reasons of patriarchy, many of these are women, which I don't, this is not some sort of law that all of these workers have to be women, but this is the kind of thing that comes about. They are not recognized to be workers, which we already talked about. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that there is a strong role for public action in increasing women's employment opportunities. As the example of Manrega and these various schemes show, we are not always doing it right, as the examples of the scheme show. And we are not always doing it against the grain of traditional occupational segregation. In fact, most of the time we are doing it with the grain. So if you want to identify where public policy can really make an impact, It is in the creation of non-agricultural employment opportunities against the grain, right? And fully acknowledged workers who come with the status of being workers, the right to collective action, social security provisions, and so on. And I think public policy can do all of these things because there is a massive need for investment in public goods and services in India that everybody acknowledges. So, you know, there's work to be done, and we can do it, and we can create these work for women, you know, eliminating many of our problems in one go if the public policy is well designed. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I see a couple of questions for Ms. Brinda Karat. So I'll put those questions up now. So the first question to you is, with intensification of migration from rural to urban, particularly in view of the pandemic, what policy prescriptions would you advise, suggest concerning the migrant workers, particularly women? There is another question which says that we see women in the forefront of so many agrarian revolts, but we do not see much participation in the leadership of farmers' organizations today. Could you throw some light on this?
What is absolutely critical is what is the legal framework for migration today? And as you know, in the name of labor reform, the Interstate Migrant Workers Act, which was the only law which was there to help and regulate and ensure some minimum wage for migrant workers, their registration, their identification, and a host of things, is actually being scrapped by the present government in the name of labor reform. So even a law which is quite poor in its conceptualization, in the sense that it deals only with women or men who are employed by contractors and not who negotiate their own contracts directly with their employers. So that is a big lacuna in the Act. But I think what is essential today is to have a legal framework for migration to ensure that we can address some of those issues which came up so clearly at the time of the pandemic. A, the abandonment of migrant workers by their employers, by their contractors, without wages, without security, without registration, without identification, which meant we saw in India, the whole world saw, this huge army of workers. I would say it was a silent protest who had to walk home. So I think the legal framework right now is very, very critical, and we need mechanisms both in the rural areas at the block level to help to negotiate better contracts within a legal framework for migrant workers. Apart from that, even in movements, migrant workers are very marginalized. I mean, I know we have tried to organize migrant workers, but it's extremely difficult because both of the type of migration, circular migration, short-term migration, long-term migration. So it's difficult in that sense. But I think that is also a very, very important lesson that we all learned from the pandemic. Now, as far as the second question about Kisan leadership, this is an ongoing struggle within the movement. As Sandeepan very correctly said, the General Secretary of the Kisan Sabha, when he spoke to him about women, he said, yes, we talk about feudal relations, but within our own movements, how to bring more women into the leadership is certainly a very critical issue. And I think Kisan movements have to address this.
We have a couple of questions for VKR. The first question is, can data from a few villages be extrapolated to give a clear picture of these issues at a state or national level? This is a question that we come across, so I'm sure that you will handle this. And then the second question is, since women do not generally own land in rural India and class analysis is at a household level, what can we say about women's position within a household? Yeah, these are the two questions that are directed to you.
The first is a question that we get quite very often. That is, how can data from 27 villages, or for that matter, 100 villages or 150 villages, tell you all that you need to know about India? No, the answer is no, obviously not. But put it the other way, can you possibly say anything very intelligent about India without studying its villages, without seeking truth from facts, without understanding agrarian relations in different agroecological situations, without looking at how the relationships between employers and the employed work out in practice? No. And I think that it has been the bane of, well, India's had a long tradition of going to villages, understanding, trying to understand the lives of people through participation, observation, and study. We've done some work on this. This has had waves. It's a tradition which started during the freedom movement. For a long time, it did not. There was a long gap, particularly in the 80s. We've come back to this now, and I think we've heard from everyone here that if you were to actually stick to, if your only sources of study and understanding were the National Sample Survey and should we say the Census of India, the various other sources of data, national data that we have, of manipulable national data that we have, then we'd be in a very sorry state indeed. Now, can this substitute for large-scale source of data? No. Is it a replacement? No, it isn't. But I can tell you that, I can tell you one thing, and I know everyone here who's colleagues, students now colleagues, will know that the study of rural India, or anything for that matter, any part of India, by actually going and seeking truth from facts at that level is transformatory. It's transformatory of your understanding, it's transformatory of your life, of course, and it's transformatory of a general economic, academic understanding of the situation of the village. So that's, there's very often people say that, oh, that may be true in the village. That may be true in the village you studied. We study how different relations of production and different configurations of the forces of production produce different outcomes. And we cannot do this except through direct research. So that's my broad answer to that. The other one, Sandeep, on property relations. Yeah, in fact, this is something which I wanted to bring up, and Brinda has brought it up in her introductory speeches. It's absolutely right, and it's a big gap in my paper that I should have. We have the data. I just took it as read, and wrongly. Brinda made the point that you say in the article that the first step, that one essential aspect of proletarianization is, in many cases, not necessary, but in many cases it is. The first step is the loss of land, landlessness, in the first step in understanding whether somebody is a proletarian or not. Now, in a context where women hardly have land, even women in landed households, in households with operational or ownership holdings of land, do not actually have a title to land themselves. That makes a very big difference. And I should have, we should have given the data, since it does exist in all future rounds of this. This article will have that, future iterations of this article. The second point, actually, she didn't make it today, but she made it to me separately, which is who are the major employers in the village? No? That although we see that the peasantry, people who work on their land, are also employers of labor, this should not give the impression that they're the major employers of labor in the village just because they constitute a large section of the village. It is still the case that the big capitalist farmers and landlords and the upper sections of the peasantry dominate the market for hired labor. And that does not come out. Again, that is taken as read in the book. That's a drawback, and I'll make good on that in future iterations of the article. I'm grateful both to the person who asked the question and to Brinda for these points. I want to make two more points, if I may. Again, drawing on a conversation that I had with Brinda. Now, this is what it is, this book. And as Madhura said, and Judith also, I think, said that that when you publish, you suddenly realize how much you've left out. That's the first step to finding out what you've left out is to actually bring out what you have. And two things which Brinda brought out in this context. One is the need for detailed work on labor and self-employment in rural India for women. And that because of the great importance of self-employment, however proletarian you are, the enormous importance of self-employment. Self-employment and exploitation, self-employment and production, even in a subject like women and in rural production, the importance of self-employment. And that is something we have to study. In fact, I'll make the point in a minute. The other is women and labor migration, working women who migrate. That is an enormous issue in India. And that we were very conscious of leaving that out. In fact, we should have said in the introduction that we've left that out. But this, in both cases, and even more in the second, we don't yet have. We're just developing it in the case of our time use studies. We really don't have enough proper methodologies for studying migration yet, and we need young people to do this. They have to develop it. We have to. Because they have to travel. They'll have to travel back and forth, and we really have to develop some kind of method of studying migrant labor, which is not only case study based, but which will provide some kind of statistical data for us to work on, and methodology which does not require a sort of NSS level operation. Methodology which can be put into practice by smaller groups such as ours. Now that is something we really work. I'm sure others are thinking about. How do we develop? This is very much should really be part of our future task. And I appreciate the fact that has come out in the discussion today and in discussions related to this book.
Okay, I'm very thankful to the events coordination team, a very young team. Let me call upon Hitesh Kota, Nihira Ram, Divya Devadiga, Deepak Johnson, the events coordination team at FAS. And let me also thank Vignesh from the Free Software Movement of Karnataka, and Tapas from FAS, and Shruti Nagbhushan, one of the editors of the book, for their assistance in conducting the program today. Let me congratulate once again all the authors and the editors and the design and production team. Yeah, we'll close the call now. Thanks everyone. Thank you.